Okay, welcome everyone to SIEPR. We're delighted to have all of you here, and I hope that you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thanks so much for being with us here today. I'm really delighted that we have with us today our friend and advisory board member, Steve Ballmer, who will talk about how powerful good data can be in helping all of us to better understand our government at the federal, state, and local levels. Many of you already know Steve, as I was here down, a number of you go back some ways, so that was exciting to see. But in case you haven't heard of a little company called Microsoft, or you can't tell the difference between a basketball and a hockey puck, or you've never heard of SIEPR until just now, let me just give you a brief introduction. Steve was in Stanford's MBA program before joining Microsoft as the company's 30th employee in 1980. He served over the years in a number of leadership roles, and in 2000 was named the company's CEO. He steered the company through the dot-com crash and through the competitive terrain of online search and cloud computing, and held that job until wrapping up at Microsoft in 2014. And rather than sitting back and taking it easy, in that same year, Steve bought the Los Angeles Clippers. And when he was one of our panelists during the summit last year, the SIEPR summit in March last year, he said that basketball is the most accountable thing that he's ever been associated with because, as he put it, everybody grades everything you do. So, but Steve is someone who really likes accountability. He likes it so much, in fact, that he decided to bring a new level of accountability to one of the biggest things that we all deal with, the government. He launched a project last year called USAFacts, and the organization's mission statement positions it as a source of unbiased, contextual, comprehensive, and comprehensible information about government that informs active citizenship and fact-based debate. The only agenda that USAFacts has is to show where government money is coming from, where it is being deployed, and to shine the light on the associated outcomes. Through the organization's website and various reports, they leave it up to you to make judgment calls on how the government is spending its money. Steve has partnered with SIEPR, as well as with the Wharton School and with Lynchburg College to help identify, compile, and organize all of these data sources from federal, state, and local government sources. And his partnership with SIEPR has really led to some amazing opportunities for Stanford undergraduates. About a dozen of them worked with me and somewhat with him as research assistants during the summer of 2016, digging for data that helped get USAFacts off the ground. But we have also co-taught 2 sophomore seminars on government accountability, and many of those students are here tonight, and some from last year's seminar landed internships with him this past summer, which I think for them was quite incredible. As a matter of fact, Steve and I just wrapped up a class about 45 minutes ago, and many of our students are here today. And so usually with the Q&A, I ask a bunch of questions, but he's been around me for like 4.5 hours, so I think he's tired of hearing from me. So when we pivot to the Q&A, I may only ask a question or two, so please be thinking about what questions you would like to ask. And Steve came up with the idea for USAFacts thanks to a conversation he had with his wife, Connie, who wanted, and he will tell you, I think, more about that during his remarks. But his philanthropy in recent years has certainly been quite significant on things that he cares a lot about, which we'll be hearing about. To take just one example, his Ballmer group has directed almost $100 million over 6 years to Strive Together, a group that supports efforts at reducing economic disparities here in the US. So now please join me in welcoming Steve Ballmer to SIEPR.
It is a pleasure to have a chance to be here with you today. I pledged to myself we're going to keep this tight to 30 minutes. I didn't, I can see a clock. Okay, I can keep myself honest to that promise. When Mark first asked me to talk, he said, hey, let's talk about some of this USAFacts work. And I will, but I also decided I would talk a little bit in some senses about how government data is informing what I do in my retirement. And for those of you who are interested, I'll tell you the story. And if you're not interested, there's still probably some interesting learning in it. When I left Microsoft in 2014, as Mark was started on, my wife said to me, come on, now you got to help on our philanthropic stuff. You've been working, I could excuse it. You were very busy at Microsoft. Come on, dude, it's time to get going. And she'd been focused in on issues of child welfare and the plight of kids, and how do you find and create opportunity for kids to advance, all here in the United States. And I said, oh, no, we don't have anything we need to do there. She looked at me and like crazy. I said, no. The government takes care of the poor, the sick, and the old. All we have to do is faithfully pay our taxes. And she looked at me like I was from Mars, like that. No, we can do better than that, blah, blah, blah. And I got to admit, I had a bit of an attitude. I was kind of hot, riding high, coming out of CEO jobs, but she's my wife. So I said, all right. But I said, I'm gonna prove to her I'm right. I'm gonna prove to her that government really takes care of all this stuff. So the first thing I did is I went to my trusty search engine, Bing, and I'm still a shareholder. I may not run the place anymore, but that's a good option for you. I went to my trusty search engine, Bing, and I started to say, okay, I wanted to understand the basics. How much does government raise? Who does it get raised from? How much does it spend? I kind of had a theory in my mind, how much wealth gets transferred during the course of that process. How do you measure? And you just keep pinging these websites, and they take you to these deep kind of esoteric PDF files and Excel files, and it didn't seem like it should be that hard to me. And after doing this, the best thing, by the way, I found was created by one person, a blogger, who's created a little data site. He's 69 years old now, retired British person with data about the US government, happens to live in Seattle, but I was getting his website back from all the hits, not only to Bing, but when I went searching on Google, and it just didn't seem good enough. And then I said, I know the answer. Where's the 10K? Certainly government must write a 10K, because if I wanted to learn as a business person about any competitor, I would get their 10K and go read it. And I said, okay, where's the 10K? And I knew there was one small problem, because if you really want to look at government in the US, you sort of, in my opinion, have to look at the aggregate of state, federal, and local. You can point to any street, El Camino. Who paid for it? Was it the state, the federal government, the local? I don't know. But it is important to look in aggregate about how the money hits the road system. Who pays for Palo Alto High? I don't know. Some of it's probably local taxes. Some of it probably comes from the state or is redistributed. There's probably still some Title I dollars that come from the feds. So I said, I need a 10K for state, federal, and local. Well, it turns out it didn't matter. You couldn't find one for state or federal or local. 10Ks, I know everybody, for those of us who had to certify them and produce them and blah, 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 CEOs like to kind of complain about the process of doing all this stuff. But at the end of the day, they do have some nice properties. Number one, they are factual. And we chose to be factual. We only use government data and sources. We use nothing that comes from think tanks. We use nothing that's a research project. We use nothing that's a forecast unless it's an official government forecast like pension or future liability accounting for Social Security. Factual. I have a theory about businesses. You run them by the numbers, and while people may doubt whether that's really how government works, government numbers should inform government decisions. So we decided we're going to be like a 10K. Number two, we're going to be unbiased. You really, in a 10K, you cannot be biased. You can't say, well, we missed that one, but we're really going to get it, and our product really is better than the competition. That doesn't have a place in a 10K. You just objectively say what the heck happened. Number three, comprehensive. Part of the problem with government is, what is government? It's this big amorphous blob out there. And yet, if you don't look at it comprehensively, how can you have any reasonable discussion about taxes and revenue? It's one big blob, but it does have a fixed number of funding sources to pay for everything that goes on. Contextual. Well, you have context in a 10K. You got to show 3 years of history, and you got to show if your assets at risk. You got to kind of compare these things. Everything has got context. What happens in politics is very simple. Somebody wants to make a point. they pluck one number out of nowhere and they make it sound like a big deal. No history, no sizing compared to anything else, just that one little number that they can use to confuse you. So I said, no, we got to be like a 10K. Context is very important. And you got to be comprehensible. It turns out, as dense as people can find some of these 10Ks, you do have to have logical organization. There's these things called segments, and you got to explain your business in comprehensible pieces, and that's really important. So those were kind of our principles. We wound up going to over 120 different government databases. And by the way, we have local numbers included, but I can't tell you road quality in Palo Alto or in California. We can tell you road quality across the United States. So we got a lot of work to do, but these are only the first 120 databases that we used. And we looked at money in, money out, population served, because demographics and income cohorts are very important, and outcomes as measured by government. How good are our roads? Are our roads good? Well, last political season, we heard they're no good. And yet they've been proved every year over the last 30 years. They're the best they've ever been, according to the folks who measure that on behalf of the government. And that's with a sort of a relatively fixed, at least index to population and economy, a relatively fixed CapEx infrastructure in the roads. Not what the political debate was about, but an outcome by the numbers. Quality of bridges, quality of roads. So you could still say they're a problem. If I'm a mom crossing a bridge that might be structurally deficient and I got a baby in the back, I might think the right percentage of structurally deficient is 0. And the fact that we're a lot lower than we were 30 years ago may not be all that compelling to me. So 10K type diligence to try to make the government comprehensible. The big problem you have oftentimes if you have a complicated business as a CEO is what are your segments? You know, they're supposed to reflect how you run the business, and we know nobody knows how to run the business of government in the United States. In fact, nobody's in charge. It's kind of the brilliance of the system. I used to think before I started this, the president had some power, but really it's the Congress that has some power. But really, take Medicaid, Congress really has no power because it turns out the states actually set the Medicaid budgets because they decide who's eligible and they put up matching funds and all the feds can do is match what the states come up, blah, 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 blah. Geez, how do you get a form of organization? And, you know, I had this list. Here's the 14 things that government does and 14 things, who has 14 segments. And finally, one of our team members said, I know what the segments are. Let's look at the preamble to the Constitution. Well, here are the segments. Establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. Promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Although the posterity got left off the slide, to ourselves and our posterity. Those are the 4 segments and purposes of government. And then you can kind of write down in a simple way, okay, what do we do to accomplish those objectives? Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. There's crime, there's natural disaster, there's commercial safety, safeguarding consumers and employees from business, child safety, safeguarding kids from their parents. And then how much money gets spent, what kind of outcomes do we achieve in each of these areas? And we produced literally a 10K, 170 pages, USAFacts.org. I encourage you to read it. We will be updating it. This year we publish on Tax Day, April 15th every year. We figure that's a day when citizens deserve to know what the money they spend is being used for. We created an annual report with a little annual report summary. The summary's 50 pages. The full annual report's 300 pages. Pretty dense with numbers, but the students in our class are very familiar. We make them wade through these 300 pages as part of our class. We have a website where you can navigate and find things. And this time, we've now created these things we call facts in focus, which are more topical. And for example, if you take a look at the House legislation, the tax plan and the House legislation, I'll just show you a little bit. What we have here is the impact of the House's tax plan on people by income quintile. Bottom 20%, yeah, I'll pop out the top 1% for this crew. How much benefit are people receiving from the new tax plan? Turns out I had noticed that the change in corporate income tax, remember, who owns corporate income tax? Shareholders. There's no mythical thing called the corporation. But corporate income tax will wind up saving me more. I'm in this top 1%. But on average, it's $19,000 for everybody in the top 1%. And you can see that when you add in some of these factors, so each of the policy changes being proposed, how does it affect families by income quintile? How would it affect single people with no kids, single people with kids, and so on. So we try to organize the data in a way where you can see what's going on. We just, in this case, use the JCT forecast. That's all we have here is what we get out of the Joint Committee on Taxation. Factual, analytic, and consistent with not only our segments, but also our demographic cohorts. At the end of the day, what you want to know is not just the outcome, but the outcome on you as a citizen, or me as a citizen, or somebody who lives in on a Native American reservation up in the Pacific Northwest, or lives in South Central LA, or whatever the case may be. Oops, I got to go back. Okay. You know, there's lots of ways to cut the data. Here's a citizen's point of view. Total income and total taxes by type of income and type of tax by income level. The top 1% is not to scale. That's what those hashed line means. We don't have a long enough screen to capture the top 1% and have everybody else be legible, but it gives you a sense. What percentage of taxes of various forms are coming from people in various income quintiles? We have a slide that will show you how have income quintiles changed over time. Right now, to be in the second income quintile, you make between $8,000 and $31,000. If you're in the top 20% of people, you make over, what's the magic number? $113,000 puts you in the top 20% of people by wealth in this country. That generally surprises people, I would say. Generally surprises people. Government transfers, $23,000 is almost every piece of income that people in the bottom 20% have. That includes Medicaid as an example. People ask me, well, what surprised you? I'll give you a good example of something that surprised me. How many people work for the government and what they do? Since we're in the accuracy business, 23.2 million people work for the government. And are they bureaucrats? Which is what most people think. The answer is no. Most people are not bureaucrats. What do people do who work for the government? Number one, they work in education. K through 12 education, higher education. If you take a look at it, it's almost half the people. So about just close to 11 million people somehow work in the educational system. And that includes janitors, as well as teachers, as well as professors at state universities and the like. Active duty military, the number of war fighters, 1.3 million. Hospitals, government runs so many hospitals. You don't think about government hospitals, but University of Washington runs a large hospital. That is a public institution, unlike the Stanford Hospital, which is a private institution. But there are many public hospitals. They employ 1.3 million people. None of them I would not refer to those as bureaucrats. There's 1 million people in the police system. My son's actually visiting a state penitentiary in Bakersfield today. He'll meet some of the 750,000 corrections officers in the United States. So when you really look at it, the number of people who are, quote, bureaucrats, unquote, was dramatically smaller than I would have thought. I chose to break out something called government-run businesses. Government runs, utilities and water and sewer and the post office and the lottery and the liquor stores, depending on where you live. There are almost 2.5 million people who work in businesses that the government runs. You may or may not choose to think that's a good activity for government to engage in, but you certainly wouldn't argue that those people are bureaucrats. There was a lot surprising in many areas. One of the things that I guess I concluded, this is my perspective, everybody can conclude what they want to, is generally government in the United States works a lot better than I thought it did. I felt much better about my taxes and the outcomes that are achieved. I wound up worrying about two things. Number one, I do think the budget should, I have opinions about everything, but the democratic process works all that stuff out. There are two things on which I publicly have real positions. So number one, I do think the budget should balance. I still can't get how budgets don't balance. I actually was an applied math and economics major in college, so I'm not at the back of the line in terms of understanding economic concepts. I just don't understand in the long run how budgets can't balance. It's just not in me to understand that. And number two, I do think that the plight of kids, there are more kids born into situations where they have no shot at the American dream from the day of birth than there should be. Everybody born in America should have a shot at real opportunity, the chance to advance economically. I'm not sure how to define the American dream, but to me it's the chance you can move up. Relatively. For everybody to move up, that's GDP growth and the rest, but do I have a chance to really move forward? That's interesting. Okay, we're offline there, but I'll go back here. And again, the numbers that we got on this thing as we dug through, there's Federal Reserve data that helps. If you were born in the bottom 20%, what is the probability that you will move up out of the bottom quintile? It's 66% for all kids. It's not great, but it's not terrible. For black kids in America, the number's 49%. That's certainly not acceptable to me. If you're born in the bottom 40%, what is your chance you move up? It's only 45% for all kids, and it's only 33% for white kids. And the probability in most instances, if you're in the second quintile, is that you'll move down is more likely than you will move up. So back full circle then to my discussion with my wife, I said, oh, this is very interesting. Okay, I'm all in with you. And the numbers were setting us free, or at least me free. My wife likes numbers, but I'm probably more the numbers lover in our family, if you will. And so we took the data and created another view around it, excuse me, which is how does money get applied to people who are in poverty? What money gets applied? How much is it? What does it get spent on? It's about $1.3 trillion that you can argue is really targeted. This is, remember, out of government spending of about $5.5 trillion. 1.3 trillion targeted at folks who are in economic distress of some form. There's income supports, housing supports. Healthcare is by far the biggest piece. Before I started this work, I used to think Medicaid paid for things like broken arms. I've learned through my work with my wife that Medicaid pays for many interesting things. I watched a Medicaid-sponsored session of a therapist working with a mother trying to teach her how to better raise her child. I didn't know that was a Medicaid-qualified expense. And I'm pleased, in this particular case, I thought Medicaid probably shouldn't be paying, but I do think it's the right kind of thing for Medicaid to target because it does save future costs in the system. Nutrition, welfare, education. Education here meaning specific educational spend for poor people, Pell Grants, Title I dollars, et cetera. The other thing which I've learned, this is separate now from USAFacts, the numbers aren't. The K through 12 education system is obviously very important for people hoping to bust out of poverty, and the criminal justice system is unfortunately way too important. There's also a few things that are off the balance sheet. The thing that was interesting then as we dug into this, because now we're trying to say, okay, how do we, as people who are fortunate, actually invest to help improve the situation? First thing we recognize, and now I'm off the USAFacts discussion, but I've been informed, my wife and I, what do we learn? Well, when you really dig into the issues of kids born into poverty, one of the worst things you'll find is that they're subject to what researchers call these adverse childhood experiences. And literally, it's an exponential, depending on the number you have, based on the number you've had, the probability that you will have addiction and other mental and behavioral problems rises basically exponentially. This is things like living in a single-parent home, having a relative in jail, being abused sexually or physically, being neglected. I joked with sometimes in our class, is it better that we require poor mothers, single mothers to work in order to achieve the EITC, or would we be better off if poor single mothers were actually home with their kids? Which one in the long run is going to give us a better outcome? I don't know, but it's a question you can ask when you take a look at the numbers. You take these kids, they grow up in tough situations, and they're in environments in which their physical safety is at risk. Housing instability really is an issue. We're looking at building a new arena for the Clippers, and there's this little motel right on just off the site, and we've been wondering whether we could pick it up. I thought it was a motel. Motel's a motel. That's what I thought before I started all this stuff. I learned that this motel is actually like an apartment building to the people who live there. And it's not a motel at all. It's people's, by and large, long-term but unstable housing because the rates change night to night. And of course, business accessibility. I'm from Detroit. I drove 20 miles almost in Detroit and never saw, on a large street, and saw no grocery stores. Package stores, yes, no grocery stores. So in a sense, what it said was, despite all this government money that's being spent, we're not helping kids with their mental health issues. The safety is not yet good enough. The housing stock is still too unstable, and we haven't really gotten capitalism to work at all on the plight of these kids who are born into disadvantaged circumstances. And I'll focus on the kids because I think of it like a piece of software. The right time to get software right is on the design phase, not late in the process. You want to help kids get right as early as you can in their life. You don't want to try to fix it up when they're 18, 19, 20 years old. It's just going to be a lot harder. Again, separate from USAFacts, the approach that we have gotten most excited about, and this is all my wife and I focus in on philanthropically. At the end of the day, I also learned that government doesn't own these problems. Government funds programs. Programs help people. But if you actually were to say to somebody, who is accountable for kids developing in a way in which they have a chance for success, somebody will say, well, it's the school system. Of course it's not. The school system's only there to try to help you get grades. But if you can't come to school because you have to babysit your younger sibling, if it is unsafe to come to school, you won't show up at school. If the school itself is unsafe, there's a problem. If you're malnourished, it turns out a friend of mine started a not-for-profit here in LA, here in California. Eyeglasses. Half the kids who struggle cannot see the blackboard in school. It turns out Medi-Cal will pay for eyeglasses, but it doesn't pay for the first fitting. So he kind of designed a program where these buses go to schools, get the kids fitted, and teach their parents how to apply through Medi-Cal for eyeglasses. But the community is the place this can all happen. The community, if the community wants to come together and say, we will take sort of a shared accountability, and we will engage business to do what it needs to do. We will try to connect the community groups in. We will be part of supporting the right not-for-profits. I learned something else about not-for-profits. What are not-for-profits? Are they sort of philanthropic enterprises or no? I thought they were when I started this journey. It turns out not-for-profits in the social service sector are not philanthropically funded. They're government contractors. Almost all the not-for-profits we meet with are someplace between 50 and 90% government funded. They go for grants. I thought they meant they were going to donors. No, they're working on government contracts. There's a not-for-profit called the Children's Institute in LA that we support. It's about $300 million, 85% is on government contracts. Mostly Medicaid, frankly. Mostly Medicaid. There's a variety of others, but they happen to have 60 different government contracts to get the 85% of the $300 million that funds this stuff. What that proved, by the way, at the end of the day, to me, is my wife and I were both right. Government pays for everything, but is accountable for nothing. She was right about that point. And that's not a slight. The other thing, just as a tech person talking to a number of people I know in the room who are in the tech industry, is the use of technology to focus in on the plight of kids and families is really not very good. These not-for-profits are small. They mostly use Excel spreadsheets, which I'm very thankful for in a certain way, but it doesn't automate the processes in quite the way that you would really want to. The ability to exchange data in a community is weak. The privacy regulations are tough. And there is a real opportunity for technology to be leveraged to make a major difference. From a philanthropic standpoint, these are some of the areas you can invest, or we have found to invest anyway. But the first thing I would say is, what is the role of philanthropy then? Philanthropy's number one job probably is to test out new things that government can't yet afford to do because they're not sure they work. The risk capital, if you will, in social services has to come from philanthropic enterprise. It's not likely to start with a government-funded program. The takeout financing has to be government financed because you're never going to get philanthropy to pay for enough stuff when you look at the number of poor people and poor kids in the country. Number two, there is fill-in funding that the government doesn't pay. It's not very good on paying for infrastructure. Look at John, I think the same problem exists in universities. The overhead is not well covered. The program is generally reasonably covered. The same thing is true in the philanthropic enterprise. There's a role for philanthropy there. Turns out, I didn't know government could actually accept money. It can. We've wound up funding a number of consulting projects that governments themselves don't have the money to go do. But they say, hey, we know we want to re-engineer this process. We know we want to change the way we pay these not-for-profits to deliver services. We just don't have the money to go do it. Government leverage is a very important thing to do. And oh, by the way, if you just want to impact individual people, yes, there's homeless shelters to be supported, there's food banks, but at the scale of the problem, it's really government system reform and reforming the way money gets spent and having communities take some ownership in these problems that at least my wife and I have found most exciting after looking at all this government program and where all this government money comes. One other small story because I got kind of fired up about it. My wife and I are funding a consulting study with the King County, which is Seattle, King County Department of Mental Health. The goal there is to try to get people who come in who need help with addiction issues to see somebody and into an appropriate treatment program that may not be the criminal justice system same day. Because if you lose people, you lose them, you don't necessarily come back. So they've been walking us through what the mental health system looks like in King County. The first thing I said is, well, how many people? You know, this is like a businessman, right? How many people are mentally ill? And what are you doing to capture them and bring them in the system? That's not what they're there for. They have, I don't know, from what it looked like, about 200 different government funding sources. And their job was to pass it out the way the state legislature or the county government said it should be passed out. That was what they could do. And they're doing their best to fit the pieces together. They're not there to solve the problem, not because they don't want to. These are very talented people. It's just not the way things are structured. We're particularly interested in the mental health and behavioral health problems because that's where these adverse childhood experiences show up the most. I don't know why I got all wired up about that, but I did. These are the kinds of things that we wind up funding: family planning, parent education. There's a Project Fatherhood we've come into contact with. Since most families don't have a dad, most poor families don't have a dad at home, dads don't have very much in the way of good role models. What do you do? How do you help? What difference can you make? Community policing initiatives. LA, there's a move to try to embed police in the community instead of having police just show up when there's a problem. Startup funding for that, we found that to be a good use of money. The problem is these things don't suck big money. There's no not-for-profit or even government. You say, here's $100 million. You can do that with Stanford University. You can do that with hospitals. You can do it with universities. You can do it with research programs. You can do it with massive funding to projects outside the United States for vaccines and medicines. There's no equivalent to that in this area focusing on kids and families in need in the US. There just doesn't exist. It's more of what I might call a ground war than it is an air war, where you can't just, as a software guy, of course, I like to build something once, have it works everywhere, there's no marginal cost, it's a magic cure-all. This stuff just doesn't lend itself to, it lends itself to software, but it doesn't lend itself to magic solutions. These are some of the kinds of grants we've been involved with. And it really was a full circle experience. From government data to understanding what doesn't work, in our opinions. Everybody can have their own opinion what doesn't work. To understanding where government money plays a role, where it doesn't play a role, what do we need to understand outside the sphere of government, and how then in that context can we as a family make a difference. So that's what I got for you today. I'll look forward to questions and discussions. I was 33 minutes. I told Mark I'd probably run over, but I was tighter than I thought, and appreciate your attendance today.
That's great. That was really interesting. So it's been, as you can probably imagine from that presentation, quite an experience co-teaching a class with Steve. The first class that we taught together, I can't remember if this is the first or the second, Olivia may know, but about 5 minutes into the class, I was talking about an area that I've done a bunch of research, and Steve looks across the table at me and says, "You have no idea what you're talking about!" And I thought, this is going to be really interesting. So, and it's been a bit of a wild ride, but it's been a very fun for me and has
Did anybody see the play or movie Oklahoma? There's a song, the farmer and the cowboy can be friends. This is the businessman and the economist can be friends. It's just a different way of thinking.
So it is. So it's been a great experience, and I've certainly learned a lot about it. And I'm curious. You've now been involved in this area of economic mobility. Is clearly something that you care a lot about. And as you've drilled down on the data and have been involved on the front lines, I'm curious to have your sense of, do you think things are getting better on that front, or are you optimistic that things will get better on that front in this country in the coming years, given the landscape of government policy, given what's happening philanthropically? Because it's clearly an area where things aren't great as we think they now stand.
Well, one of the things, kind of the end of the USA, and we're not at the end of the USAFacts process, but as we got everything pulled together, one of the things I asked myself is, are things getting better? And with the two exceptions I mentioned, I thought things were getting better. I do not think the notion of people trapped in poverty has changed much. There's not a lot of longitudinal data, so I can't tell you by government numbers, we can't tell you what economic mobility looked like 30 years ago and what it looks like today. More of that'll come to the fore as we get sort of access to these private data sets that Raj Chetty here at Stanford and other people are using. But it's almost by definition a problem. People who are trapped are trapped. It says it's not improving, at least for the people who are trapped. And you could say there's some kind of tautology there. So no, I don't think it's getting better. No, I don't think with current course and speed it's likely to get better. I do think the answer has got to be community with support for government as opposed to government with support only from taxpayers. I think it's too much to ask. I do think it'll require collective action. Unfortunately, I kind of like the way business works. There's a CEO, people who work for you, blah, blah, blah. That's not how this is going to work. This is going to require small not-for-profits that really are designed to stitch the community together. I think of it as almost a Six Sigma-like approach. You have to get the community to agree on its goals for economic mobility, how to measure those goals, and then continue to do the kind of root cause analysis that you do with Six Sigma processes. My wife says never use the word Six Sigma when you're in a discussion of, sort of social issues, but I just did it, so don't tell her. Yeah.
And so you've been involved in a number of different communities, certainly Detroit, Los Angeles, Seattle, and other places as well. And one of the things that I, in my research, have looked at a lot is the healthcare sector. And one thing that I've discovered is there's huge variation across places. There's this saying like geography is destiny in healthcare. If you get treated in one place versus another, you can see a very different system. And I'm curious, as you look around, is the approach that's happening on the front lines at the local level, is it very different across these places? And is there any mechanism for places where there are great successes happening to diffuse to other places for them to learn? Because you talk a lot about these smaller nonprofits. If they're doing great things in Detroit, can LA learn about them?
Okay, so it sort of starts with what's Medicaid. Medicaid's the biggest part of the 1.3 trillion. What is Medicaid? I have no idea. No idea. Every day almost I learn a new thing that Medicaid pays for that I never would have thought. There's actually a literacy program in Albany, New York that gets paid for with Medicaid dollars. Because somebody has found, the local Medicaid authorities have petitioned the state and found that it turns out literacy helps improve health and will drive down healthcare costs. Medicaid can pay for it. And the things that are most interesting to me, frankly, are not the broken arms. It's the things that are really contributing to opportunity. And I had no clue Medicaid. Fathering classes, Medicaid pays for them. Because kids will be healthier if their fathers are good fathers. And the Medicaid, frontline workers have figured these things out. And yet, if you told me this, 2 years ago, 3 years ago when I started, I would have thought Medicaid really is about broken arms. For kids, anyway, it's about broken arms. And the other thing I'd say from a health perspective is I think the public health issues are perhaps more important than the, quote, health care issues. Do moms get the right kind of advice prenatal? So are the moms living the right kind of healthy lifestyles? Do the kids live healthy lifestyles? Asthma is a huge problem in poor communities. Huge problem in poor communities. Those are not issues that you would attack, so to speak, with a traditional fee-for-service Medicaid arrangement. But Medicaid dollars can be used for that too. I wouldn't be shocked if you'll find some building that got the asbestos removed with Medicaid dollars. So in a way, I'm glad society's figured out ways to take Medicaid and make it into a public health budget, not just a healthcare budget. And it is different all over the place. Could people learn from each other? I'm sure they could. But you'd still have to get all these little waivers. It's crazy that our government system works this way, where all these things wind up with their own special little waivers that generally have to go back at least to the state government, sometimes have to go all the way back. Here in California, these things are almost always managed and administered by the county government. It's not a city function, and in a sense, it's not even a state function. The counties have a lot of authority here in California.
So I'm tempted, because Medicaid's a program I've studied so much, to spend the next 15 minutes on Medicaid, but I know I want to get a chance, give people in the audience a chance to ask questions. So with that, let me see if we have some people here who have questions. Gary, right here in the front row.
So great presentation. So 2 questions, right? So I think there's a lot of descriptive elements you shared, right? So are you leveraging this data to create a predictive platform which can give us insights as we move forward? Second, I know you made a comment on taxes, right? And the debt, right? To me, if you have to pay 60 cents to $1 taxes, right? There are a lot of inefficiencies, right? And what are those inefficiencies based on the data digging you did, right? Which could help us.
Well, let's see. I remember number 2. Remember a quick number 1, which was?
Platform.
In terms of a lot of the data you kind of shared. Is
Oh,
very
data. I got it. Predictive. We don't do any predictive modeling. it fundamentally is at cross purposes with what we do. It'd be the equivalent of making forward-looking statements in your 10K. And others can use the data. We actually are creating it with our partners at University of Pennsylvania. We're creating an API around the data, so if people want to do their own modeling and analysis, that's why we work with this group at Penn. They do have a forecasting project, and we're trying to share same back-end infrastructure. But we're not going to do any prediction and modeling. That's for others to do. We're like a 10K. We're just about what happened. I don't even like life expectancy because it's a forecast. I prefer to look at average age of death. That's actuals in the life business. It's getting less encouraging as a man approaching 62. But anyway, I won't dwell on that right now. In terms of inefficiency, I think the government's a whole lot more efficient than people think. In fact, I don't think you're going to you'll get some out of efficiency, but you're not going to get enough to make a sort of sizable dent in the deficit. You know, inefficient. Are schools inefficient? There's $600 billion in schools. Well, I can argue schools are inefficient. Student-teacher ratios have been getting smaller and smaller. There are fewer students per teacher now by 30%, I think, than there were 37 years ago. Educational outcomes, not improving. But I wouldn't call that an efficiency measure. I think a lot of that has to do with investment in special education, kids with disabilities, but at the end of the day, the educational outcomes have not moved the same way. But I don't think there's a lot of fat in education. I don't think there's a lot of fat in the police. I don't think there's a lot of fat in the fire. There's no fat in Social Security or Medicare, right? I mean, it doesn't take a lot of money to, it's pretty efficient to collect the money. And what does the United Way like to say? 91% of United Way dollars go straight through the non-for-profits. The IRS is better than that. It doesn't take 9% from the IRS to collect that money and redistribute it. So, there are patches, I'm sure, of inefficiency, but they don't pop out of the numbers. What pops out of the numbers is things are actually reasonably efficient. That is, you can see directly, money came in, something came out. It's probably, are the police as effective as they need to be? Should we have 10% fewer police? Would that be more efficient? I sort of call that more of an effectiveness measure than an efficiency measure.
I think Alegria, right here.
Also, working off the question on the budget, so you talked about effectiveness. Now, if you say you believe publicly in balancing the budget, at least over time, where would you cut or where would you increase? Like, that's the real question.
I think you have to actually do probably a little bit of both. I think starting point taxes will have to be higher if somebody's serious about balancing the budget. I think the notion that taxes can go lower and lower and we're going to balance and not basic. I mean, the only place you're going to make material differences in the numbers is in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And I just don't think the world's going to tolerate dramatic reductions. I do think there needs to be some reduction in Social Security and Medicare. We did in our class today talk about means testing, Social Security and Medicare. That, I believe, should probably happen. It's very complicated to know how to means test the programs for senior citizens, but I do think there'll need to be some improvements in cost in those programs. I do think taxes will have to be higher on affluent people. I got to say, before we started teaching this class, I actually didn't even realize that you don't have to pay Social Security tax over, what is it, $127,000, and I don't know why that's okay. We'll have to recognize that Social Security is not a savings program. It's a wealth redistribution program. I think a lot of things will have to change, but it'll be revenue increases in addition to expense cuts, in my opinion.
Okay, great. No one over here? Okay, great. Sam.
So you talked about how USAFacts is strictly fact-based, unbiased. It's clear that it's influenced the way you and your family have spent your philanthropic dollars. What do you hope to do, if anything, to organize grassroots participation based on the facts? Would you partner with other organizations doing it yourself, or do you think just by exposing these facts that will happen naturally?
It turns out most things don't happen organically that way. Hell, we don't even have as many visitors to the website as I'd like to have, quite frankly. So we have a real effort to figure out how to package our stuff in a way that is, if you try to package things into a tweet, you can lose context and comprehensiveness. So how do we stay true to our mission? We're probably not going to get everybody, but if we can get the 20 or 30% of people who are really interested in these topics in America a little more educated, that would probably be a good thing. We're working on what that means. I think if we could get search engines to surface this data more easily, might help people with a lot of stuff. We're taking a look at that. People have pushed on the creation of curricular materials. What would it mean to actually, you get out of high school and you actually know that we have 3 branches to the government, but you don't really, how many governmental jurisdictions would people say you'd guess there are in the United States? 100 or less? How many show of hands? 100 to 5,000? How many people think there'd be between 100 and 5,000? 5,000 to 20,000? 20,000 to 50,000? 50,000 to 90,000? Over 90,000? 91,000. 91,000 different government organizations in the United States. How do you understand this stuff? How do you put it together? How do you have some elementary numbers, whether you're just graduating from high school or you're going to Stanford University? That's kind of what we've been playing around with in our class. It's more of a seminar than curricular materials. But we're looking for the opportunities. What would be my grand dream? My grand dream would be that there'd be a Sarbanes-Oxley process for government, i.e., legislators and the key executive branch members would have to say, we have read this. This accurately summarizes what exists. It does not say what we think should be done, but we have read these statements, we acknowledge them, and we you can probably say you should be able to ask us a question or two about them because we will attest that we know these things. I would consider that a home run. Sarbanes-Oxley for government.
So I have one question.
Maybe
for you,
with some audited financial statements too would be nice. GAAP accounting, there's a few things that would be nice. By the way, we take the government numbers as is. We don't try to gapify them or de-gapify them or make them consistent. We just use them.
So we've talked a bit in the class about taxes, and there's a lot of talk right now in the news about tax reform. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts as a business person and as a philanthropist, what you like and what you don't like about the current tax reform that's out there.
Well, as it relates to individual tax reform, that's as much as anything, democracy should sort that out. I'll be relatively quiet. The notion that we use the tax system to incent a bunch of crazy behaviors, I'm not saying the behaviors are crazy, but to use the tax code seems kind of like a weird thing to me. But society, this relates to simplification, society should work that out. As it relates to budget deficits, no, I have a bigger issue. I don't care how you get there, but I don't think there should be deficits. Most of the deficits being created by the new tax plan are being created by the change to the corporate tax system. The corporate tax system actually does need to change. I know this as a CEO, and it's not effective for helping U.S. business, but I'm not sure why shareholders should be getting a windfall. Seriously, who pays corporate taxes? I do. Why do I say that? I own Microsoft shares, and Microsoft pays these taxes, but they're really paying taxes on my income. I'll bet everybody in this room is actually paying corporate income taxes. And your income taxes are getting cut. And if we want to balance the budget, I'm not sure the people in this room who own shares should get the windfall. You can argue who should pay that, but if you want to rationalize the system, somebody should pay for it. Just the easy thing for me to say as a businessman, okay, we're going to not charge shareholders in the form of the current corporate income taxes, but we will charge them in the form of, wealth tax, increase to the capital gains rate. It is ironic that if you put the capital gains rate equal to the ordinary income rate, it would just about equal the $150 billion less taxes that will come in through the corporate tax system. Somebody might argue that that's a reasonable way to stay at least deficit neutral And I'm not an economist, I'm just a business guy. What does that mean? I just look at the data points from the past and I project the future. I don't do fancy economic manipulation. This is just me personally. Well, when you set the prices of products, you're not doing fancy economic manipulation, and yet it's kind of an elasticity test. That's what all these things are. And I take a look at it and say, I'll bet when push comes to shove, you wouldn't find as much elasticity as people think. You increase the rates, and it's fair. I mean, how much of the stock market rise do you think right now is due to the fact that people expect corporate income tax rates to come down? A bunch. And I don't know. I don't happen personally to think it's particularly fair that my kids are going to have a bigger deficit so I can have a higher Microsoft stock price today.
Right. Okay, so we've got one more. We'll have one more. Maybe I'll try to get another one in. Yeah.
So I love the presentation where you started out with the 4 pillars of the foundation of what the Constitution represents. I also love the comment about Lean Six Sigma applied to a socialistic setting. I'm mystified with we should pay higher taxes than to solve it, with the concern that 50% of the budget today is going to entitlement type programs, and we can't tax our way out of the spending there. There needs to be a substantial reform in this doctrine going back to the 4 pillars that you outlined.
No, I agree. We need to cut, I'm just going to comment on the room at large, we need to cut the amount of money you get. I agree. Mostly we need to change the amount of money the government pays the people in this room. That's entitlement reform. This is not mostly about entitlements for less affluent people. It's about entitlement reform for more affluent people. Should we means test Social Security and Medicare? I mean, if you want to do entitlement reform, that's the first question you're going to get. Not should everybody get less, but should people who can pay for these things tend to pay for them? It turns out one of the students in our class today found the original speech Roosevelt gave on Social Security and was quoting from it. When Roosevelt first spoke about it, he didn't talk about it as a savings plan. He talked about it as a safety net plan. And Social Security today works more like a savings plan, and people feel entitled to it like a savings plan, not like a social net plan, social safety net. If you did that kind of entitlement reform, you might get some progress. Medicaid is called an entitlement, but it's a whole different ball of wax. Medicaid has more disciplined budgeting. Medicaid is not going to run out of control because the states do set the total Medicaid budget. All the feds do is match. Until Obamacare, all the feds did was match what the state spent. So if a state didn't want to spend too much on Medicaid, it didn't. And that's why you see Medicaid spending vary quite a bit across the country. Very low because hardly anybody, for example, in Alabama or Mississippi, relatively a much smaller percentage of people would be covered in Alabama and Mississippi than would be covered in California, for example. So I agree with you, we have to get after expenses. I don't think the biggest issue here, when I say the social issues, I don't think you're going to be able to cut your way out of that by whacking away at Medicaid. I don't think that's going to get you there. So I do think it's some combination of taxes. And for the federal government, of course, the federal government, just as a small reminder, collects about 2/3 of the tax. It doesn't collect as high a percentage as you might think. The federal government collects 2/3 of the tax, and it transfers a bunch of that money to the states. So the federal government spends more like half the money, and the states spend more like half the money.
Okay, so with that, I think we're a couple minutes over, so we should wrap up. Please join me in thanking Steve Ballmer.